Hello, welcome to The Drum. I'm Julia Baird. Coming up, Thursday thought bubble. New South Wales Police Commissioner Mick Fuller proposes a phone app to signal sexual consent.
We need to have the conversation about consent. We need our kids to have a better understanding. We need our juries to have a better understanding.
Rancour over sexual assault complaints in Canberra. We'll look at the contrasting views of the government's performance. And JobKeeper or Job Sweetener. New research exposes the dozens of ASX-listed companies that cashed in during COVID. And joining me on the panel, he's back again, senior reporter at the Saturday paper, also author, Rick Morton. Great to see you.
Thanks for having me, Julia.
Lawyer and Liberal Party member Jeffrey Winters is going to be joining us very shortly. In Wollongong, founding director of Nowra, a not-for-profit focused on Aboriginal child and adolescent wellbeing, the very busy Dr Nari Brown. Hi, Nari.
Hi, how are you, Doc?
Good, thanks. And in London, author and journalist Lucia Osborne-Crowley is up early to join us. Great to see you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be here.
It's always a pleasure. If you want to join us on Twitter, you just have to use the hashtag #TheDrum to find others also in the conversation, and we are also on Facebook now. Now, over the last 2 months, an intense national debate has boiled over in Parliament, in schools, in broader society. We've been asking serious questions about the treatment of women, over how complaints of sexual impropriety and sexual assault are dealt with, and how we can all be better educated about what constitutes consent.
At the moment, what is challenging is sexual assault, and particularly on women. We're seeing over the last 5 years continual increases, and you're seeing the justice system being overwhelmed quite often with this issue of consent.
Look, there are no easy answers, but the New South Wales Police Commissioner thinks technology could be the solution, and in particular, an app.
It would be a private type app, and these companies who have dating apps, they create these apps that bring people together, which is a complex thing to do, right? Bring two people together who agree to go to dinner or go to the movies. Surely that's something that they could consider within this to protect the people using these type of apps.
And by his own admission, the app could be a way to keep more people out of the justice system.
I would hope that the app stops matters going into the justice system, because the justice system doesn't seem to be helping the offenders in these matters or all the victims. If you have a 2% success rate of the prosecutions that are only 10% of the matters, then we're failing both ways, right?
But Labor's Tanya Plibersek says the plan is full of holes.
Consent can be withdrawn at any time, so the fact that you've signed up in the beginning doesn't mean that you're up for everything your partner suggests. We really need to be teaching consent to our kids as part of a respectful relationship program that's age appropriate in our schools, in our homes.
Now, Rick, Mick Fuller said this could be the worst idea he's had all year. Yeah. What do you reckon? Look, and I have to preface this with, at The Drum, we love running ideas up flagpoles. Yeah. Some are the good, some need to be tested. Have a go, throw it out there, let's talk about it. But this one seems to have a few glaring issues.
Yeah, sometimes flagpoles are structurally unsound. I think the Commissioner's had a shocker, and he, by his own admission. I mean, look, he should have consulted more widely, if he didn't already, before running this idea up said flagpole, because I think even if he had, it sounds like he was going to get some bad advice, because if you listen to him at his press conference there, he just sounds like an awkward dad trying to give the sex talk, and he's just not quite fully across, I think, how this stuff works in the modern age, and the fact that he's a bloke and, he seems like a good one. But he still has those blind spots, I think, that all men have, even men like myself to a degree, but particularly straight men who are just kind of stuck and they don't know how to navigate this issue at all.
Right, and a blind spot discussion is actually a very useful one to have. But Lucia, can I bring you in here? I think the issue, I want to know what you make of this suggestion, and in particular the assumption that consent is something that you do at one single point in time. How do you read it?
Yes, yeah, exactly. I mean, I totally agree with Rick and also with Tanya Plibsek. There are a lot of issues here. I think one of the most glaring ones, as you said, is that this proposal is a backslide, I think, on our ideas about consent rather than a move forward, because it has built into it this idea that consent is a blanket contract, that we kind of agree to a sexual encounter once at the outset, and then that applies to the whole night or to the whole encounter. And we're really trying very hard to move away from that idea. What we really need to be thinking about is consent as being enthusiastic and ongoing. So something that is continually negotiated between two people. And the idea that it should only be given once, and that it's given in this kind of blanket contract type form, is really, really worrying to me. Also, I think anything that moves towards this idea that we as people shouldn't be able to read other human beings and understand consent, and that we need a kind of legal document or a tick box, again, is definitely moving in the wrong direction. I think it sets the bar much too low for men. I think if they think that they can just get the yes and then go ahead with it, then we're really sending the wrong message. We should be teaching people how to constantly be checking in with their partners and be looking for enthusiastic consent. And a tick box on an app does nothing to ensure enthusiastic consent, because we know also that people could be coerced into signing up to the app or being made to feel pressured into doing it. So to me, I agree that it's good to throw ideas out there. This one is a real problem, I think.
Lucia, you've also written very powerfully about your own kind of violent sexual assault. Would this have made any difference to you, Annette?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I think this is the really important thing about this app. I think it misses all the kind of key situations that we need to be thinking about. So when I was attacked, for example, it was a very violent assault. I was attacked by a stranger in the middle of the night. And there is nothing in this kind of app set up to safeguard someone from a violent assault, in the sense that if a woman is unconscious, if she's been beaten up, if she's been drugged, you could easily take her thumb, unlock her phone, and sign off in the app. And certainly in my situation, I was in such a violent, the man was armed, and if he had, with his knife, said, you have to say yes on this app, I would have had to do it because I was afraid for my life. And then, of course, that would translate to the justice system. And I believe that this app, I can only really see this leading to fewer prosecutions and fewer charges and fewer convictions, because it could act like a rubber stamp to kill rape prosecutions before they even start. Because in my situation, for example, that perpetrator could argue, I've got this rubber stamp on the app, even though I didn't give that consensually and even though I was coerced. And then I think the other point is the kind of opposite situation to me, which is, and we know that this is incredibly common, which is sexual assault that happens between intimate partners or people who know each other or people who work together. And there's a much more complex power dynamic going on there. And if you have a power imbalance in a situation, there is nothing to say that the person with more power in that situation can't use that power to coerce someone into saying yes on an app, in the same way that they can coerce someone into saying yes in real life. So I feel that women could easily be made to feel like they have to say yes on this app, and there's nothing really inbuilt in it to actually protect women. To be honest, it feels like it, in both the situations, in the kind of one extreme with a very violent situation, and also in the more nuanced situation, I can only really see it protecting men and acting as a rubber stamp for men later on in the justice system.
Because there's a lot of evidence, particularly when it comes to domestic violence and abuse, that technology is used by perpetrators incredibly effectively. But just quickly, while we're on this point, Rick, you too write about a sexual assault a few years ago in your book. Would this app have made any difference to your experience?
No, none at all. I mean, I wasn't cognizant for almost that entire night. I wouldn't have been able to sign my name if someone had asked me, and I don't remember anything except appearing in these moments. I don't remember making choices.
Right.
So, you know, making the choice to sign an app, I don't think would have done me any good
Wouldn't
whatsoever.
worked at all, or you could have been forced into it, or
Yes,
anything.
it would have come back to haunt me.
Welcome to the panel, Jeffrey Winters.
Thank you, Julia.
We have not seen you for some time. Lawyer, Liberal Party member. Welcome.
Good to be with you.
Now, OK, let's apply your kind of legal brain to this. How do you view finding answers in technology?
Well, I think Lucia's point is the most prevalent when it comes to a legal one. That's the evidence that would be used or necessarily flow from such an app. I mean, does the checking in, as it were, of consent then apply for a period, and that overrides any oral evidence that might be elicited in court, or so on and so forth, which obviously it should not, which then diminishes the utility of the app altogether. I think the second you engage with this idea that consent is a moving, constant state of existence as opposed to a momentary contract that applies for a period where you just know this is a stupid idea. But I must say it's very good from the Police Commissioner. Usually he has very silly ideas and doesn't recognise how stupid they are, whereas this time he has. So New South Wales Police Force is moving in the right direction. That's positive. Let's look for the light in all dark corners. But I guess also the other issue is privacy. I mean, we're talking about one of the most intimate, if not the most intimate things we engage in with each other as humans. I mean, could you imagine potentially your checking in and checking out of this app being used in other contexts? ICAC, for instance. I mean, like, also I'm terrible at checking out. It would mean that I'm currently consenting at about 16 pubs in Sydney, and I'm not sure when that's going to expire. But, you know, not to make light of it, it's a very serious topic.
No,
and
but
I
it's
think
true.
It just highlights the stupidity of the idea.
Right.
And I think at the end of the day, the whole conversation we're starting to have is about respect for each other and the importance of getting back to understanding the human relationships we form and how we should treat each other. If we're going to have a ticker box get out of that, it's actually a policy idea that's running in the opposite direction to the direction where all the answers to this problem will be found, which is a better understanding of each other, a better understanding of respect, and kind of that mutual contract we all sign up to as members of society.
And also possibly about systems that are designed by men without input from survivors. I mean, it's been tried before by a Dutch company, I understand, which was designed by men and actually didn't work. It was taken off because I think it contravened some of the rules of the providers that it was posted on. Nairi, can I bring you in here?
Is that on?
Oh, have we got you?
I can hear
No,
you.
we don't have you. Okay, so I'm going to come back to that. Oh, we do have you. Okay, fantastic.
I'm just a little bit slower than normal, apparently.
Just keeping us on your toes. How do you view, I mean, look, just a few days ago, Mick Fuller, head of New South Wales Police Force, says, look, we have a real problem with this system. Of 100% of those people that come to us, only 10% charges are laid. Reporting sexual assault, 10% charges are laid. Of those, only 10% result in convictions. Absolutely negligible number. So much like smaller than other crimes. It seemed that he was acknowledging, as I'm sure he was, that there was a real problem in both the police and the courts and the criminal justice system generally. So what do you make of him now talking about apps?
I certainly heard him mention dating apps, for example, but that's setting a very low bar. I believe that it is a systems issue to a large extent, but there's still so much stigma that is associated with relationships and their nature outside of the law, right? So interpersonal relationships and how you negotiate communication with another individual. I think that particularly for young mob, when they're moving into exploring their identity and dating and their social capacities and capabilities, there's so much confusion and it's a really complex mix of threads. So irrespective of whether our current generations are social media savvy or not, it still requires a focus on that interpersonal communication and education around those relationships, around understanding what yes is, that a singular yes does not in fact give you carte blanche permissions then to anything or everything that may follow. But if we still have social environments whereby, as you mentioned, a very small proportion of the victims actually have their cases taken to a point where they can be prosecuted in the favour of the victim. We still stigmatise individuals. Everything sits very much in the balance of the offenders. That's my personal opinion. So why would people then want to drag themselves through that kind of focus and scrutiny and through a system that isn't in fact built for their narrative, their experience, or an acknowledgement of what they need from it, and not just in terms of justice, but everything else that goes with it. I know that was a messy answer, but it's very, very complex. Right. Consent is complex and it's dynamic, and there is no singular answer. And there is certainly not a singular app that will assist us in that manner. Perhaps the apps would be better for issues of education, communication and connection versus I said yes at this time on this day, let's just chuck that in the cloud and see what happens. We know from studies that once young people put something out there into the ether on social media, there is an immediate disconnection from that content. We need people to still feel connected to that and feel responsible and accountable for their actions for themselves and then in the context of others.
All right. Well, one thing that is clear is that the events of the last few months are hurting the Coalition. A news poll from earlier this week showed that Labor is now ahead of the Coalition for the first time since the start of the pandemic. And while polling given to us exclusively from Core Data Research shows that the Prime Minister's personal response to the allegations against Christian Porter has been largely negative, it's also split down demographics. For instance, nearly 7.5% fewer women than men approve of Scott Morrison's handling of the solution. And among Generation X and millennials, a large majority disapprove of the Prime Minister. The highest amount of support for the PM comes from baby boomers. Now, there's increasing acknowledgement now, I think, in Canberra as well as elsewhere, Jeffrey, that this is hurting the Coalition. Is this going to be viewed in Coalition ranks as a cultural problem to be addressed or a political problem to be battered away?
Well, it's a cynical answer, but politicians have a job, and that's to win elections, they would say. Therefore, I think...
Is that their only job?
I don't think that's their only job, but I think that's the discussion that's largely held, or at least it's in the top 3 points of the agenda in the party room, I'd suspect. And
but we have a profound cultural issue now. That's the point of governing, isn't it?
What's remarkable is that, just to take it purely from a polling point of view for a second, the government was in an extraordinarily strong position, extraordinarily, where we were flirting with the idea of an early election and whether or not the Prime Minister accepted that was coming from his office. It was a good enough rumour with a solid enough basis that you'd have to think it was something they were thinking about. Yep. Now the discussion, only a space of a few weeks later, is, well, if we can limp away till May next year, maybe then we'll be in a better position once we've weathered the storm, which is such an awful way to consider what this is. Is this a major problem for the government? Massively. Is it a huge opportunity for the government? It could have been. I mean, this is one of those rare moments where it's a problem that both you and your enemy face. Right. There is no disagreement that this is a problem for both the major parties and the crossbenchers. Canberra in Parliament House as a whole. So why wouldn't you take an issue that's one that affects you both and become the champion, the leader, and go out in front when the opposition has to follow you?
How?
Well, okay, so the first step is obviously to allow the Kate Jenkins Commission and inquiry to take place. And there are obviously problems with that, and we're all aware of the issues around freedom of information requests, and whether or not the necessary protection of the witnesses is in place. Yep. So that's problematic, but you must let that happen. But that can't be the only thing. I mean, the Liberal Party itself has had so many internal inquiries into the role of women and the women's issue that we have. Why don't you just reach into the drawer and look at some of the recommendations that Chris McDivitt former federal president, first female federal president, made in her report, and say, all right, actually, it's very easy for us on Tuesday morning...
Chris McDivitt, did you say?
Yes.
She did a report recently into the internal problems in the Liberal Party.
Considering the role of women and how they might be promoted in the party, which is an ongoing issue the party is actively looking at, and they should be congratulated.
Well, that is significant because she was so successful at getting women into seats in the Liberal Party.
Correct.
When we look at 1996 election and John Howard's success with the number of
and
women
we've only
there,
gone backwards since, right?
Right.
So it's easy as, you know, if you want to be lazy about this issue, which you shouldn't be, but if you do, there is internal information for you to grab to and think, what are the cultural problems we have as a party? How can I look to the knowledge that an elder stateswoman has given to us and implement that? So why don't we start the Tuesday party room meeting with those ideas? Why don't I go out front? And yes, it's symbolic. And I get the Prime Minister's point about I've invited the marchers in to come and talk to me, the protesters. I don't feel the need to go out. Fair point. But actually, the symbolism is important too. It shows the solidarity and the action's much louder than the words. Small steps like that would have been a good way to set the tone. And then why not reach across the dispatch box and say to the opposition, listen, we're both up to our necks in this. We know it's a toxic culture. There's no suggestion the Leader of the Opposition or the Prime Minister have anything to be afraid of. So why don't they just lead, which is what they're sent to do? I mean, one thing that really stood out to me this week, and I've never defended John Howard on this program, so let's brace for this moment, but was a story earlier in the week which covered the leaders of the government that have gone out and faced protesters that were protesting on issues against them. Of course, you saw your Hawkes and your Keatings, as you'd expect, and your Whitlams, but there was John Howard out there in the gun reform and in the sorry debate as well, hearing the crowd
facing it,
really vehemently, aggressively opposing him, but he did that. How have we got to a point where that's better leadership than what we're seeing right now?
Nairi, do you see this as a significant opportunity to lead or to kind of usher in cultural change?
I'm somewhat concerned about the growing perspective that a politician's job is to be re-elected. They are democratically elected public servants, and their job is, in fact, to serve the public. And I think they're moving further and further away from that platform. And it's a great privilege, which I think less and less they're appreciating. I actually hold them to a higher standard and a higher account. And disappointingly, they're not anywhere close to that. The government of the day, irrespective of the flavour, it is their job to progress the nation. The job of the opposition is not to oppose, but to present you with an alternative government that, in fact, will also progress the country. This is an opportunity, and I would agree, for them to be doing so much better around these issues, which are critical social and cultural issues. And yes, they will have a political flavour because that is the nature of things, but that should not be their imperative in the first instance. More than 50% of the total population are women. So do better by us, and perhaps that will then keep you your job.
All right, now I should say, if you've been affected by anything we've been discussing, these are hard conversations. Call Lifeline on 13 11 14 or 1800 RESPECT on 1800 737 732. Now, today is National Close the Gap Day, with the campaign releasing 15 recommendations for reform. They include an emphasis on health equity, helping First Nations communities adapt to climate change, and a renewed call for the adoption of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Pat Turner is the lead convener of the Coalition of the Peaks, which negotiated last year's new national agreement on closing the gap. She told The Drum last night that the refresh has delivered closer engagement with Indigenous communities.
The strength has been in the formation of the partnerships at the state and territory level, so strengthening those and really and creating those in many cases for the first time, where Aboriginal community-controlled leaders of service delivery organisations and policy influencers are sitting at the table with the government officials at those levels, working things out.
Meanwhile, in a speech at the National Museum of Australia, Indigenous leader Noel Pearson urged the government not to abandon the decades-long push for constitutional recognition.
Constitutional recognition of Indigenous Australians is not a project of woke identity politics. It is Australia's longest standing and unresolved project for justice and inclusion.
Naira, you worked on a subcommittee that worked on the health target for the original Close the Gap, like more than a decade ago. Some things have improved since then, some things very stubbornly have not. Do you share Pat Turner's optimism that this new kind of or improved working with Aboriginal leaders on some of these targets is going to lead to better outcomes?
I would certainly agree with Pat that over the years we have been able to establish consistent, strong collaborations with politicians, departments, governments. We are sophisticated in terms of our understanding of health and policy. We have great leadership and expertise across all of our peak bodies, for example, the community controlled sector, the Indigenous doctors, CATSANAM, our other professional bodies, and our land council. So the network and depth of expertise around these issues is actually quite extraordinary, and we've been able to leverage that into our relationships with government and influence policy, service delivery and resourcing decision making. I think that we could still do far better, particularly around some of the health targets, timelines and impacts, because we have all of the evidence and the biomedical information that we need to make sure that our services, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander specific, but also mainstream, are addressing issues of preventive medicine, prevention and screening, as well as timely intervention for existing disease, such that if they implemented fully the recommendations we made 10, 12, 15 years ago, we would almost be at the point where we would have not only halved the disparities in outcomes for chronic conditions, we'd be 75% to 100% of the way along the line and ahead of schedule. But as it stands, on some of the clinical biomedical work, we are a long way behind. But hopefully we will be able to make greater gains around some of the social determinant work that is underway.
All right, you are watching The Drum. With me on the panel, senior reporter at the Saturday paper, Rick Morton, lawyer and Liberal Party member Jeffrey Winters, in London, author and journalist Lucia Osborne-Crowley, and in Wollongong, founding director of Nowra, a not-for-profit focused on Aboriginal child and adolescent wellbeing, Dr. Nairi Brown. Australia's labour market has apparently returned to pre-COVID-19 levels, with unemployment falling to 5.8% in February, down from 6.3%. An extra 89,000 people found jobs last month. And this is good news for the government as it continues to defend next week's wind down of JobKeeper support.
We brought it in when it was most needed, and we didn't hold back. We kept it in as the crisis went through its most virulent period. But as we got to the other side, as it began to emerge, as companies were getting back in their feet towards the end of September, we started to gear down those supports and the jobs increased. We go in with a very strong jobs run-up into the next phase of Australia's comeback and Australia's recovery.
The jobs boost comes as new research revealed that dozens of companies which received the government's JobKeeper subsidies were more profitable in the second half of 2020 than the year before, when COVID-19 was but a viral twinkle in the eye. Corporate governance advisory group Ownership Matters looked at the government subsidies received by the 300 largest entities listed on Australia's stock exchange during 2020. Dean Parch is the group's director.
So 66 ASX 300 companies received JobKeeper in the second half of calendar 2020. In total, they received $1.4 billion in that period. 34 of those companies who drew down $285 million actually had an increase in their trading performance in 2020 compared with the 2019 period. And JobKeeper accounted for roughly 20% of that. So you've got a situation where these companies quite legitimately claimed JobKeeper at the start, but as the pandemic conditions improved, JobKeeper was a real tailwind to their profits. New Zealand had a similar approach. They applied a harder test. You had to be 40% down in revenue on a rolling 40-day period. But you only got it in the instance for 8 weeks. But they retested quite hard. So as their conditions lifted, so too did the amount of their version of JobKeeper reduce. We were more generous. We applied no retest till the end of September. And importantly, New Zealand differed in one very unique way. They have a completely open and transparent register. So I can look up any company and I can see exactly the amount of wage subsidy that was received. This was done in order to prevent that gaming and provide some transparency so that companies weren't being unjustly enriched. If the things that we observed in the public companies, so in the ASX companies, were representative of those in private companies, it'd be something like $10 billion might have gone, we don't know because the data is secret, might have gone to companies that were in a better trading position on New Year's Eve 2020 than they were on New Year's Eve 2019. There are many, many small businesses for whom JobKeeper was a lifeline, but equally there were a small number for whom JobKeeper was a sugar hit, a boondoggle, a bonanza, the likes of which they'll never see again.
A sugar hit, a boondoggle, a bonanza.
My fourth book, Julia.
Okay, some really obvious questions here about accountability when we don't really have the full information about 97% of the program's claimants, and obviously transparency. Do you think this passes the pub test here, Rick?
No, and it doesn't for a whole bunch of reasons, but just really simply, the government has a massive interest in following the money when it comes to people on welfare, people who have nothing, and yet when it comes to corporations, in a scheme that they were warned would probably feather some nests if conditions improved, or even in the aged care sector with bonds, they can't see where the money goes once residents have paid it in some cases. There's just a supreme lack of curiosity, and I think that's a problem for a government, and particularly with their priorities, I think.
Jeffrey, obviously the government is going to point to the terrific job figures,
which is great.
It's great, and it's unexpected. But there's some of the obvious flaws in the way this was administered. Was that once qualified, a business receives funds for the entire period, regardless of the changing of circumstances. There was no monitoring of those changing of circumstances, even when they went into significant profit.
They didn't have to do mandatory reporting to Centrelink every 2 weeks?
Strangely enough, no. And or getting dobbed in, and none of that kind of thing.
So cynical.
I know. I'm too old for this now.
And nor is there any suggestion that companies have to pay it all back, as some kind of honour system appears to have emerged, which has obviously its flaws as well.
Well, I think the first thing to remember, which I don't think anyone's ignoring, is that this was all stood up very quickly, and which the employment figures show today to extremely strong success. So I think let's give the government a pat on the back where they deserve it, and I think we can all agree they deserve it in the employment numbers. Now, the employment numbers don't necessarily give you a justification for affecting the JobKeeper policy. It may have an implication for the job seeker policy, but I'm not encouraging the government to revoke that one straight away either. I think the point to think in the JobKeeper is that, of course, perhaps an aggregated assessment of small and medium enterprise profit and loss statements might be a better way of understanding when you should remove the JobKeeper subsidy. And I also think, regardless of whether they were up as well, one good quarter, the first good quarter, is not the time to take it off. I would think you wait and see what is the secondary flow-on effects and how it flows out. At the end of the day, I mean, we've got to remember, we were all quite shocked when this government put so much money, public money, into the economy through businesses and direct cash. So that's a great thing. I don't think we should jump and attack them for pulling it back when they get good signs, because that's certainly what encouraged Conservative governments to engage in much more sort of, socially aware, progressive, market optimising activity in the future. So I think we've just got to be really careful in the way we assess this. And also remember, the decision to pull this back had been made well before the employment figure was released. But again, the employment figure isn't a reason to justify a JobKeeper change.
But there are also obvious comparisons to the UK, for example, where most of the companies that operated a profit during that time have paid the money back.
Yeah, there is. But I mean, let's be honest here, we're not very good at enforcing the corporate tax regime anyway. So let's be good at the billions, recouping the billions of dollars that are currently owed by
That's
the
a low bar.
No, it's
not. We're talking about $100 billion scheme here and its administration.
I just think it's true that, I mean, we, as a country, through the government, committed to getting a lot of public money out there and flowing, and we did do it. And we did it through a mixture of policies, and I think that showed a sophisticated approach from both the public service and the government. Reining it back in is always going to be as messy as rolling it out, and I just think we've got to be a bit slow to judge and see. At the end of the day, the government is going to want to shut down the programs as quickly as they can justifiably, because they've got a huge budget deficit they're going to be mindful of, which is important moving forward.
I think, funnily enough, they probably could have done the step down of JobKeeper much easier if they had tracked the money from JobKeeper in the first place.
But I guess this gets back to the resources point. I mean, at the end of the day, the ATO, MyGov, Services Australia, etc., do have limited resources. The pandemic posed a huge new workload for them. I think by and large they've done a pretty fantastic job. There are going to be holes in it. Should we consider ways in which we recoup money that was inappropriately allocated? Absolutely. Are we talking about finite resources and how much we can coop back? Also, absolutely. So I don't think you can have these absolute views necessarily when you've got a confined resource situation.
Let me just bring Nairi in on this question. Do you not think that there'll be people like regional operators, tourism operators who haven't been able to get JobKeeper, people who've lost their jobs and haven't had the higher rate of job seeker will be asking questions about how we don't know so much about where this money has gone?
Yeah, and I think they absolutely should be asking those questions. They're public funds by and large. And so for the rest of us who aren't large corporations but are actually small and medium enterprises, many of whom have had to close their doors permanently because of the lack of consistent support, we probably find that the larger corporations that had the assets and the resources to continue business as usual to a degree versus those that have actually had to turn away their young employees, close their doors and relinquish their businesses, they'll find that the disparities will widen, and that in fact we already know, particularly in regional, rural and remote areas where resources, jobs, few and far between, and we've reduced somewhat the diversity of employment that is available, they will continue to struggle unless we can be a little bit more clever about how we reinvest in either their diversification or the creation of opportunities to rev the business and the regions back up again.
Lucia, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the point about resources here is a really, really interesting one, because as Rick said, we know the government is able to track public money very effectively in very specific situations when it's being given to people who desperately need it. And the fact that less of an effort is being made to track this money here and to be transparent and accountable is very telling. And there is a question of resources, but I think it's about rebalancing where those resources are focused and making more of an effort to make sure that big companies like this are more accountable, because this pandemic has really displayed and exacerbated all of the inequalities that already exist in our society.
Right.
The fact that some companies are able to profit during what is essentially a mass extinction event really shows you that, while some people have had the most difficult year of their lives.
Right.
And I think now would be a great time to say this pandemic has shown us where the most dangerous fault lines lie in terms of the inequalities in our society, and it's time to rethink how we distribute resources. Yep. And it's time to say, we need to be more accountable with this money that's going into companies that don't need it because they are already posting a profit.
Right. And I should add that, the Auditor General is, of course, having a look at this process, and we'll be reporting in October, so we'll keep a close eye on that at the drum.
Their budget was cut as well.
Their budget was cut by a significant amount, I think, and I don't mean to laugh at all. But I want to end with asking this question. What does it mean to discover late in life that you're still suffering physically from a severe trauma experienced as a child? As a 7-year-old, Rick Morton witnessed his older brother suffer third-degree burns. He was left to process this on his own, with his mother and siblings flying more than 1,000 kilometres away. Rick's father was physically present on their remote Queensland property, but entangled in an affair with the governess. Rick Morton writes in his new book, The Year of Living Vulnerably, about coming to terms with a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder.
The moment I find out my friend is seeing someone, it is as if the world goes blurry. I can feel myself leave my own body. There is ringing in my ears and a sensation that has no equal in daily life, but what I can only describe as 100,000 ants marching up from my feet along the length of my nervous system, nesting in my chest. It is the most agonising type of fear where death itself feels imminent. I still have complex PTSD and a tendency to dissociate when it is triggered. It feels a lot like I'm in one of those extended sequences in war movies after the bomb has gone off and the sound disappears and the world around is blurred.
Now, Rick, you describe these kind of symptoms of experiencing PTSD so kind of graphically and lyrically. But how did you work out that this was what it was you were dealing with?
Strangely enough, I was at a writers' festival. So books are good for things, I think is something we can take away from that. I was sitting next to a woman who was reading out from her own book about what trauma felt like to her. And I realised that she was describing precisely what happened to me every single time I had one of these episodes. And I'd been battling with these massive nervous breakdowns, or at least that's what I thought they were, for 7 or so years. And I just thought I had really bad anxiety. And so I was sitting there, and I remember it so clearly. I was on stage, and I just remember thinking, oh my God, I need to go see a specialist. Because I think, I wrote a whole book about my family's trauma and never thought that it applied to me. I just thought I was being, anxious.
And the specialist confirmed that?
Yeah, within half an hour. I'd never heard of complex PTSD, by the way, before I went to that specialist appointment. And funnily enough, I was on the drum 3 days later or so, and I spoke about it for the first time that night, and people were like, oh my God, this guy knows so much about complex PTSD. It's just because I'd just been to the therapist.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I was parroting what he'd told me. And it was so revelatory.
So what does it change to have that diagnosis?
It gives you a target, I think. So, I was doing every kind of therapy that I could possibly try on the Medicare funded system when I wasn't earning that much money. And even when I was, it's very expensive. And it mostly is cognitive behavioural therapy, which is useful to some people to a point. But the trauma stuff, it works differently for different people, but I found that the trauma therapy is much different to what you might want to do if you've got anxiety or depression or another kind of mental illness, because what you're trying to do is target the wiring in the brain, which ironically is doing what it evolved to do, which is to give you an early warning system for things that are really painful, emotionally, physically, or otherwise. So, being able to focus my efforts and also to know that there was a bigger part of the story happening. It wasn't just in my head, it was in my body. And that was so, the explanatory power of that was so useful because a lot of the things I ended up trying had to do with my body, like muscle relaxation, which I was doing on the campaign trail following Scott Morrison around, 16-hour days.
So you would have needed that.
Yeah, well, I probably should have done it anyway. And it was just a thoroughly weird time in my life, to be quite honest. But
I just want to bring in Elena here. I want to bring in Lucia here. Sorry, I mentioned the title of your book because you've written, she's Elena, because you've written about you've written about this exactly, kind of surviving a violent sexual assault and being physically ill for 10 years afterwards and not knowing what was going on with you. When you were finally figuring it out, through all the kind of hurdles and obstacles of the medical system, what did you come to understand about trauma and the way we carry it in our bodies?
Well, I think this is such an important question, and I thank you so much, Rick, for your book and for writing about this and complex PTSD in particular, because I think we have such a long way to go in terms of understanding how this works. And the body is such an important part of this. So for me, I had most of my life, I was suffering very severe episodes of anxiety and fear, and also having kind of physical responses and physical breakdowns. And because there is not a great deal of conversation in the public arena about trauma, I genuinely thought this was just part of my personality. I thought I was just very, very anxious, not able to handle certain situations very well, and very afraid. I thought I was just kind of constitutionally afraid. When in fact, all of these were, as Rick said, incredibly sensible responses that my brain was having to try and protect me. And from an evolutionary perspective, those things make perfect sense. And the thing that really changed for me was the diagnosis and the understanding, because when I was able to see a trauma specialist and understand what I was suffering from and how that is different to other mental illnesses, very, very different, both in terms of its presentation and in terms of its treatment. Once I was able to understand that, I could properly treat the illness and recognize the symptoms of it, not as, and I think this is important, not as failures of my own self, my own constitution, not as weaknesses, but as symptoms. And I think that's really, really important. Because I learned, and because I was able to see a trauma specialist who really could dig into how this was affecting my body and how this was affecting my mind, I was able to acknowledge those symptoms and just see them and treat them and understand better when they were going to come up. And it's the not knowing that is really, really difficult in trauma, and that is so exacerbated by the fact that we don't talk about it very much, and we don't have a good understanding of how it works. I mean, similar to what Rick was saying, I had no idea that so much of my life was governed by symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. I thought, based on books that I'd read, that it was a disorder that only related to wars, which couldn't be more wrong. And actually, one of the first things my specialist said to me, which I found really helpful, was he said, we have this idea that PTSD comes from a certain type of event. So an event has to be very, very serious in order to cause post-traumatic stress disorder. But that's not true at all. It's actually about how the brain experiences an event and how it processes an event. And that can be, so he said to me, he grew up in a war-torn country, and he said, I have experiences of war that are traumatic, and I have experiences of war that are not, because I had the right emotional support around me to process them at the time. And so there can be experiences that we don't see as on this level of severity, but that in fact are more likely to ingrain symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, because there's so much about this condition which connects to how we process things and the support we have around us when we're able to process fear.
And one of the people who provides that support is you, Nairi, right? Because you work a lot with kids who are deeply traumatised. What have you learnt from that? What do you notice?
Yes, I have the great privilege of working with children and adolescents. And whilst trauma can be associated with a single catastrophic event, for most, it's ongoing and chronic exposures with cumulative impacts over time that I still think that, broadly speaking, we don't understand as well as we should. We tend to focus on the symptomatology without understanding the narrative and the ideology of why people are presenting the way that they do. So, trauma over time can be what most people would anticipate. So physical abuse, including sexual abuse, neglect. It can be direct and indirect exposure to mental health issues in their family, the incarceration of family members, those with a substance abuse problem, for example. It can be instability, family and community violence. So what it then does is impact on every aspect of the development and the life of the children and young people. So everything from bonding and attachment to their ability to develop and maintain positive relationships, cognitive impairment and learning difficulties, behavioural disorders, as well as mental health issues and emotional well-being issues like anxiety, depression, self-harm, suicide, substance use, eating disorders. It's quite a diverse and broad spectrum. We also have increasing biomedical evidence that demonstrates that trauma, and particularly trauma in childhood, predisposes us to an increased risk of chronic conditions, high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, insulin resistance, diabetes, other endocrinological and metabolic disorders, failure to thrive in munchkins,
which is what Rick writes about. Yeah,
it's quite extraordinary. And in fact, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and other vulnerable populations, the impacts are in fact transgenerational. And so trauma begets trauma, and we create these environments of impaired human capital. So until we become better equipped and have a better understanding of what trauma is, how we recognise that narrative, and for people that don't have the verbal capacity, whether they're children or those that are at a point where they've been so traumatised and haven't been supported to be able to express that, then their behaviour tells us everything that we need to know, and we need to be paying mind to that.
Right, which is, I'm sure, what you're doing on most days, Nairi. And Rick, this is part of your contribution to, with kind of the gift that you have to write, to do so kind of openly and honestly. At the time you realise that you're vulnerable, to go ahead and double down and live vulnerably. You know, what did you find?
It's
Tell us what you found.
You know? And like, I mean, this is the thing. I mean, I'm not the first person in Australia to have a trauma, developmental trauma, and I didn't want to speak on behalf of you guys on the panel, but in Indigenous Australia, it's particularly bad, and it informs everything about our lives. And having learnt of the kind of the way it bleeds through everything, I thought, you know, it would be, you know, I didn't know, and I'd written a whole book about trauma, and I didn't know. So, like, who else out there is not getting treatment? Who is not getting... Psychologists didn't tell me. 7 of them over 7 years didn't tell me, and they were lovely people. But
so tell us, because there's so many things that you look at in here. Like you start off with a failure to thrive, with the need for physical touch, which took you to Japan, cuddling kind of fuzzy, furry robot seals that you seem to really fall in love with.
I just wanted to hold a seal, Julia.
Look, whatever it takes.
And I couldn't break into SeaWorld, so it was...
And you speak about forgiveness, you speak about cephalopods, like all these kinds of things.
It's our common interest.
Yes, we have lots to talk about there. But tell us where you landed. Where did you end up?
Look, I mean, the definition of complex PTSD, as it was given to me, was that it's kind of an emotional abuse. It's a consistent lack of love when love should have been provided, stability, security. And so I figured if that's the diagnosis, then the answer, the solution, must be found somewhere in just the random application of love and curiosity and engagement with the world. And it sounds trite, right? But I had spent my 20s totally shut off from the world. You know, I was moving, I was a robot, I was doing things because I thought I had to. I threw myself into my career at the expense of everything else. And it was an awful decision because I stopped hugging people, I stopped telling people I loved them. I was outwardly functioning, but inside I was just twisted. And it got to the point where physically I was having these horrendous stomach... It felt like I was being stabbed in the stomach with a dagger. There was no medical reason for it except that I was under extreme stress, and to the point where I had to take myself to an ER at one point and then run away. So the answer to me was to write a book which I call the ultimate Venn diagram of Rick Morton interests, which is science, philosophy, a bit of personal essay, a bit of reporting about quirky little artefacts of living that just make life worth living, I think. And learning stuff is part of that.
So staying open to the world instead of shutting yourself off is something that you found.
Turning to face it, good and bad. And I know, look, it sounds easier said than done, and it is easier said than done. But, you know, having realised bits and pieces of this over the years, I realised with, you know, uncontrovertibly, that it has helped. And it, you know, bit by bit over the years, it's made me a better person, a more loving person, and a more open person. It's
funny though, isn't it, how you say, oh, it sounds trite. I think we're almost taught to be embarrassed sometimes about the things that we really need and make us feel better.
Yeah, and I got to the point where I'm just like, well, you know what, I want a hug. I feel like a hug.
Right.
You know, I'm going to ask for permission and consent, obviously.
Can you please log into the app first?
It says here you've been, and, you know, things like that. But it's just like, well, do you know what? We're all the same. We've all got stuff going on.
Totally,
so,
totally.
I'm into it.
Jeffrey?
No, I think it's... I haven't read the book, but after this I will.
There are no obligations.
No. This is fascinating because I think one of the things it does highlight is that, you know, particularly where you've got a background that doesn't accord to the particular white heterosexual male that society is built around in our country and in our society, there is bound to be things that occurred in your life that actually do rewire you. And I find heading into my 30s, I start to be reflective, and goodness knows how twisted I'll be in 10 years' time. But you think about, why am I reacting the way I am? Why do I think the way I am? Is that normal? Is that tingling sensation that's running up my spine just what everyone feels when there's a moment of stress? And just listening to you makes me go, gosh, it isn't something I've ever thought about going to explore. You know, most of us see psychologists, and we take that assessment as being... that's the end of it.
The printhouse.
But there might be more. And
it might just be the beginning.
Yeah.
According to the Rick Morton path of living vulnerably.
Go hug a seal.
I just want to say, if this topic has raised any issues for you at all, we have to call Lifeline. You don't have to call. If you would like to call Lifeline, 13 11 14 or Beyond Blue on 1300 22 46 36. And we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. Thanks to our excellent panel, Jeffrey Winters, Rick Morton, Dr. Nairi Brown, Lucia Osborne-Crowley. Have a great evening. You're going to see Ellen tomorrow night. Good night.
Tonight, a global pandemic for which there is no end in sight. With millions of lives now affected, governments everywhere are scrambling to find a cure. The race is on to vaccinate half the world against toxic male culture.
What we're dealing with is unprecedented. No system is built to deal with the circumstances and events that we are now facing as a nation.
In a laboratory in Canberra, two of the country's best scientists have made an exciting discovery.
Well, the toxic male culture virus, or ToxM21, has existed for millions of years.
Ever since men have been around, really.
But recently there's been a massive spike in community transmissions. So after